Hey guys, now we're up to some concluding remarks that Nagel wants to make, and then we're going to look at commentary that's been made about his own paper. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to explore how Nagel suggests we should move on from his inquiry. I've done all this study, I've done all this analysis, I've come up with these philosophical thoughts. Now, here's what I suggest we do in order to move forward and do something constructive. That's where we're going to go so far. So we need to reference our prior knowledge in order to understand these concluding remarks. Then we need to explore some major questions raised by Nagel's inquiry. We need to define what he calls objective phenomenology. And then we need to explore comments made about people who have studied and referenced Nagel's text. Okay, that's what we're going to do. Your APK is, for me, pretty pleased to draw a picture again that makes of what you think makes matter and energy. Can you do that for me? Cheers. One of the key questions for Nagel is, how can we describe our experience in an objective way? Or to rephrase that, or to restate it in an implied way, is should we explore what our experiences are really like rather than how they seem to us? For him, this needs to be the major attention of philosophical and scientific inquiry in the future, because we can't really explain at the moment our answers to these questions using a physical account of subjective experience. And if we don't actually try to develop an objective framework for understanding what's going on phenomenologically, we won't really be able to make any headway when we look at physicalism or physical explanations. So really, it's time to put aside any kind of investigation into the relationship between brain processes and mental states. And that makes sense, of course, because if you read the reply to identity theory, you'd see why. You can understand that in order to make comparable or statements that equate one thing with another, you need to know what both things are in detail. Okay, so you can make what they call the same referential path to the ontological real thing that's being referred to. So put aside this obsession with finding the relationship between the physical world and brain processes. Put that aside and let's move towards an investigation into how we can objectively describe our experiences. Take a note. So from his point of view, this needs new concepts and new methodologies. And when we find these new concepts and new methodologies, we're going to call this objective phenomenology. Okay? Take a note. The overall aim of objective phenomenology will be to explain subjective experience, phenomenological experience, and to think about it, to conceptualize it to people who don't actually have the same experience. Maybe I should explain it in a bit more of a better way. To be able to come up with a language that describes our subjective phenomenological experience to people who can't have that subjective phenomenological experience. Take a note. So, for example, it would be like explaining to a person who is blind what it is like to see. Alright? We might hit a brick wall when we do this, but we've got to try. Because if we do so, we're going to come up with a full account of consciousness. And then we might be able to do that ultimate marrying between what brain states trigger our mental states and come up with a proper understanding of identity theory. Take a note. Alright, so it's time to read and come up with some nuances. Very little work has been done on the basic question from which mention of the brain can be entirely omitted, whether any sense can be made of experiences having an objective character at all. Does it make sense, in other words, to ask what my experiences are really like as opposed to how they appear to me? We cannot genuinely understand the hypothesis that their nature is captured in a physical description unless we understand the more fundamental idea that they have an objective nature, or that objective processes have subjective nature. Right, So what he's saying is, find the objective nature, find the objective framework that allows someone else who can't have that experience to understand that experience. I should like to close with a speculative proposal. It may be possible to approach the gap between subjective and objective from another direction, setting aside temporarily the relation between the mind and the brain. We can pursue a more objective understanding of the mental in its own right. At present, we are completely unequipped to think about the subjective character of experience without relying on the imagination, without taking up the point of view of the experiential subject. And remember, when human beings try to take up the point of view of an experiential subject, we're trying to experience what it's like for the human being to be this experiential subject, i.e. putting yourself in another person's mind or imagining what it's like for a human to be a bat, and that's got problems, right? This should be regarded as a challenge to form new concepts. In other words, to understand the experience should be about looking at new concepts and devising a new method, an objective phenomenology, there he named it, not dependent on empathy and the imagination. So get rid of imagination, because really the best that can produce is getting you to imagine what it is like for a human to be that organism or to have that experience. Though presumably it would not capture everything, its goal would be to describe, and at least in part, the subjective character of experiences in a form comprehensible to beings incapable of having those experiences, i.e. explaining to a blind man what it's like to see, giving him some kind of objective or understanding of what it's like to have that experience, not the brain process, but to have that experience. We would have to develop such a phenomenology to describe the sonar experiences of bats, but it would be also possible to begin with humans. One might try, for example, to develop the concepts that could be used to explain to a person blind from birth what it's like to see. One would breach a blank wall eventually, but it should be possible to devise a method of expressing in objective terms much more than we can at present. So he reckons we could explain more, but there still would be some subjective quality that would be left out. And with much greater precision. The loose intermodal, which means connecting types, analogies, for example, red is like the sound of trumpet, which crop up in discussions of this subject are of little use. So don't use banal analogies. That should be clear to anyone who has both heard a trumpet and seen red. But structural features of perception might be more accessible to objective description, even though something would be left out. And concepts alternative to those we learn in the first person may enable us to arrive at a kind of understanding even of our own experience, which is denied us by the very ease of description and lack of distance that the subjective concepts can afford. Apart from its own interest, a phenomenology that is in this sense objective may permit questions about the physical basis to exist. The physical basis of experience to assume a more intelligible form. Of course, if we understand the objective way of, or the structures of phenomenological experience, then we would be much better at matching them up with physical processes that are supposed to be the same thing. Aspects of subjective experience that admitted this kind of objective description might be better candidates for objective explanations of a more familiar sort. But whether or not this guess is correct, it seems unlikely that any physical theory of mind can be contemplated until more thought has been given to the general problem of subjective and objective. Otherwise, we cannot even pose the mind-body problem without sidestepping it. The end. Alright, let's pause this video, take some time to take notes. We're about to go over some commentary that's been made, okay? Alright, qualia and the hard problem of consciousness. So, it's beginning to become quite apparent the reason why we've read Smart, then Nagel, and now we're going on to a couple of extra philosophers, is because it seems to be, this idea of qualia seems to be something that a lot of Australians have been concerned with, okay? So this Australian philosopher by the name of Frank Jackson came up with an idea of epiphenomenal qualia, right? Which is 100% absolutely certain that there is some kind of dualism, right, created by the epiphenomenalism of the epiphenomenal qualia that he's trying to articulate. It's 100% dualist, and it describes a physical account, and it argues that physical accounts of consciousness, have falseness to it. So this guy is directly buying into some of the more direct claims that were made by Nagel, not the more conciliatory claims that he made to materialism, okay? So he is 100% for a dualism and a separation between the physical and the epiphenomenal or the qualia experiences. They have a separate reality, a separateness, a separate stuff to the physical realm, okay? And this is elicited much more clearly in what we call the knowledge argument. And if you don't remember the knowledge argument, you can tap on it here, but it's about Mary's black and white room, i.e. we put a girl in a room and she never sees colour, she can't see colour, and in the process we teach her everything about the objective understanding of what colour is. So she knows everything. She's learned every possible thing she could know about colour from an objective framework. And then she steps outside the room and for the first time she sees colour. Has she learnt anything new? If she has learnt something new, qualia exists, right? Because basically there is something that it is like to see the colour for Mary, which is different from knowing every single objective fact, okay? Watch the video, it will outline it a bit more, alright? And take a note though, if that makes sense to you. So this argument pretty much says, look, qualia is real. Our experience of qualia is proves that something exists that isn't material, and there are two types of realities or two types of things that exist: our experience of qualia or qualia itself, and the physical material world. Or to put it more clearly, brain processes and the mental states and the qualia of those mental states is separate, okay? Then another Australian, read a lot of Frank Jackson's work. His name is Chalmers, David Chalmers. And he wanted to ask some more particular questions about qualia because he was completely convinced, completely bought into this idea of a kind of dualism created by qualia. He said, why does consciousness feel the way it does? And why does consciousness have a feeling at all? Like, why do we have a feeling, a particular feeling? Alright? And these two things are called the problem of hard qualia, which looks at the properties and the feelings of what it's like to be conscious. And from his point of view, these feelings can never, ever, ever be reduced to a physical explanation. They just can't. Never. Physical accounts of how the brain works and brain processes can never account for anything that can be used to answer those two questions, right? You can never use a physical account to answer, or objective terms to answer, why does consciousness have a particular feeling? Why does we have a feeling at all? Alright, take a note. Right. And this, as you know, leads us to a situation where he also argues there are two types of substances, right? We've got the physical and the non-physical, right? They are all part of reality. Reality must be incorporated into, our understanding of reality must incorporate consciousness and the non-material aspects of consciousness in order to have a complete version of it. Because without an account of the non-material aspect of consciousness, we can't fully account for what reality is. Take a note. How does he do this? Well, he comes up with a thought experiment too, and it's Dave and Zombie Dave. Right? So what we need to understand is we've got Dave, and we've got a complete, absolute replica of Dave, a complete copy of him, okay? And the thing is, Dave is a real human being with all the functions, and over here, we've got Zombie Dave. Zombie Dave is a zombie, alright? Now, if Smart's theory is correct, there would be no difference between Zombie Dave and Dave. right? It's just not logically possible for zombie Dave to exist because he has the same brain anatomy, brain processes, and should function just like Dave. You can't have a zombie, right? If you have identity theory, it's just not a logically possible thing, all right? But the point is, the idea of zombie Dave can be imagined, and it makes sense. It's a contingent possibility, right? Might not be true, but it can be conceived. It's contingent. And if you watch a bit more of Chalmers' video, you'll find out why he believes that if something is conceivable, something is possible, so therefore there must be something in qualia. If you can imagine Dave and Zombie Dave having the same structures, but one acts like a zombie and the other doesn't, then there must be something for what it is like for Dave to be Dave, and the zombie doesn't experience that, okay? That's really important, and if you can conceive of it, it's a possibility, so there must be something to qualia. Watch the video, okay? Take a note. Now, of course, hardcore materialist comes along by the name of David Bennett and said, look, this is just an illusion, it's a furphy, it's an empty construct. Qualia is meaningless, it's empty. Take a note. From his point of view, qualia must be eliminated from an account of what consciousness is, okay? It must be eliminated from our concept of what the mind actually is and how it works, okay? From his point of view, right, the ideas that underpin qualia kind of confuse everything. And what we need to do is we need to redefine what the mind is, so that, and we need to redefine the properties of qualia so that they just become parts, or can be understood as parts of a physical consciousness, or a consciousness that is made and totally exists and corresponds to all physical states, alright? So, he literally believes in identity theory, and we need to find a way to reaffirm the idea that brain states equal mental states, okay? And that qualia is just an empty, meaningless concept. He does this in his famous text called Quitting Qualia, and he does this through several thought experiments which he calls intuition pumps, where he's trying to flush out false intuitions about qualia. And remember, when we talk about this word intuition, that's a really important word in philosophy because it means something different from other disciplines. And intuition is just something you end up knowing. It's like almost like an epiphany, a thing that you just know. Not a thing you figure out, but a thing you know after reflection or from reflection, okay? And so it's not deductively proved, it's just known. And remember Descartes, in a previous video, he argued that you intuit that you exist, and existence is basically a predicate of the I, yeah? Even though he hadn't deliberately gone out of his way to argue that that's the case, right? Well, the same is said about intuitions. He wants to get rid of false intuitions, false just knowings about the mind. And he does this by saying that when we describe qualia, it has 1, 2, 3, 4 aspects. It's ineffable. In other words, its experience kind of goes beyond words. And I think a better way to describe ineffable here would be that the qualities of qualia go beyond what an objective framework can account for. That would be a better way to explain it. It's intrinsic, it happens inside, it's private, only you have access to it, and it's immediately available to your consciousness, okay? Take some notes. And through his thought experiments, what he tries to do is dissolve the importance of those 4 key features away and kind of prove that they're kind of illusory, or they can kind of be reconsidered in a different way, reconceptualized in a different way, so that we understand that mental states underpin them. Take a note. Right. And he does this, one of the thought experiments out of many, what we call a coffee taster. Alright, so imagine you work for a coffee company and you're to test the quality of the coffee just by testing random batches. And there's Chase, the coffee taster, and there's Sam, the coffee guy, right? And the two of you are working and you've tasted the coffee, and then all of a sudden you say, look, I don't like the coffee anymore, but that's because it's the same. I'm just bored of it and I'm just not used to that quality. I'm not used to that taste. So the qualia experience for him has changed. Alright? He has a different kind of point of view of what it's like to be him and his interaction with the coffee. The same goes for Sanborn. He just thinks it has a different taste. It tastes different and I don't like it. So Chase thinks it tastes the same, but he doesn't like it. He's just bored of it. Whereas Sanborn says, look, I don't like it because it tastes different. Okay? His qualitative experience, his qualia, is very different from Chase's. And we know that. They have a different kind of qualia experience, okay? But when we try to investigate or discern what the difference is, when we try and measure it and study it, there is absolutely no way that we can factually determine what is the difference. We know they say they have a difference. It's a claim to having a difference. And we could, using the thought experiment, understand that there's a difference in qualia. But we can't ever, ever, ever claim it as a fact because there's just no way we have access to it, right? So why not reconceive of it in a way that we do have access? Instead of saying there's a different qualia, let's just say really they're just making different judgments which are based on their past experiences, their own brain anatomy, things that have happened to them. They're just making different judgments, and judgments can quite easily be understood from the point of view of brain processes or neurological points of view. So really saying what is qualia in this case can easily be reconceptualized as just different judgments which are highly correlated to different brain processes. We know that. You can reconceptualize the properties of qualia such that they can be explained through other concepts or other concepts that can easily be matched with brain processes. Alrighty? Alright, so that's it for Nagel. We're completely done. Let's go and have a look. Have we referenced our prior knowledge? Yes, we have. Did we explore some major questions raised by Nagel's inquiry? Yes, we did. We need to start looking at what is consciousness really rather than what it seems to be for us. Okay, have we looked at objective phenomenology? Yes, we do. We did. Objective phenomenology is when we have new concepts and a method that looks at the structure of experience and tries to articulate an objective framework that can be used to explain to somebody else who can't have our experience what it's like to have that experience, i.e. how do we explain to a blind man, a man blind from birth, what it's like to see, okay? Have we looked at different commentaries or comments made about it? Yeah, we've had a look at the knowledge argument. That's the argument raised by Mary in the black and white room, and we've looked at like how new knowledge can kind of demonstrate that there is something to qualia. We've actually looked at the problem of hard qualia, which is basically, you know, looking at the feeling of what it is like to have a unique point of view. Why does qualia feel a certain way was one of Chalmers' questions, and he demonstrated that that was the case through looking at Zombie Dave and Dave, and he basically said that if identity theory is correct and Zombie Dave and Dave actually have the exact physical makeup, then how can we actually argue that's the case? But most of us can conceive or imagine a possibility where you do have a Zombie Dave and a Dave. We have one person who doesn't experience qualia, but the other person does. And if you can conceive of it, then it's a possibility, so there must be something to qualia as a contingent reality, okay? And then we move into Bennett, and Bennett's argument is, look, you know, these concepts, these four key concepts that we've got about qualia, they can be reconceived and understood in a way that easily matches with brain processes. They just have to do the hard work and reimagine what they possibly can be and make the correlation. And in many ways, therefore, qualia is empty because really it can just be reconceived and understood from a point of view of different kind of mental states that easily correspond with how brain processes could work. Alright, thanks for taking the time to listen to me. It must have been a long video today, but that's just the way it's got to be. I'm going to ask you to pretty please at the chair and do the same question. Cheers.